Hello fellow gamers, wherever you may be, may your dice be blessed. In this video we're going to do a quick walkthrough of how spellcasting works, both from an individual target and an area of effect targets. Probably the two most common examples of how you use spells in GEAS. Like many spells that you might be familiar with in other role-playing games, there are all different kinds of effects that you can have. You can do a cone, you can have a flame explosion, you can have a single target or a laser ray or anything in between. But for purposes of simplicity in this video, what we're going to do is really talk about just the two common examples and how it works, and then how the mechanics actually work within the game itself. So the first thing that we have here is we have Caster McCasterson up here in the top corner, and they're facing off against 1, 2, 3 Eilings, which are floating laser beam shooting creatures, and one brutish but non-intellectual giant, I guess I could put it that way. Not the fastest of all creatures, even though it definitely
loves to eat your flesh and bones.
So what we've got here is Caster McCasterson. Let's just say that he had won the combat order round, so he will go first. When facing off against giants here, Caster McCasterson decides, well, let's try some spells to help prevent them from coming over to my side. The first spell that Caster McCasterson is going to want to cast is a Befuddle spell. In this particular spell, it's a single target. It's a sorcery 1 spell for 1 minute. Choose a single target you can see within range. The target must succeed on an intellect ability check or become confused for the duration. A confused creature suffers a -1 penalty to its action points and a -1 proficiency die penalty to all ability checks, defense, and attack rolls. You'll notice something here that says when boosted. As previously discussed in a previous video, Vitality and Vigor are your two kind of key core stats. Vitality, think of it like life or hit points. Vigor is a pool of stamina that you have that you use to power your abilities and effects. Warrior types may use it to power their attacks, whereas casters will use it to boost their spells. In this case, if Caster McCasterson was going to spend 5 Vigor, he could choose to select an additional target beside the giant. But in this example, we're not going to do that. We're just going to keep it to base level Sorcery 1 spell. So what is a Sorcery 1 spell? This is going to be considered Tier 1 right here. A Tier 1 spell has a base 2 damage. You can do a 5-foot radius sphere or 2 5-foot cubes centered out to a range of 50 feet by spending 3 Vigor. You can do a 5-foot wide line out to a range of 30 feet, which costs 3 Vigor. You can do a 10-foot cone, which is 3 Vigor, or you can choose a single target out to a range of 50 feet with no extra Vigor cost. The reason this is done is because area of effect spells, because they have an opportunity to impact more than one creature, they typically will have a base Vigor cost assigned to them as you do that. So the important thing to look at in this is we're just going to do a single target range out to 50 feet. So is a giant within 50 feet? Yes, easily within 50 feet. So the next thing that you're going to do is you're going to roll your Arcane Spell Pool, or ASP for short. And for this example, let's say it consists of 2 8-sided dice. So you roll your 2 8-sided dice and get a 6 and a 5. So what you need to do then, the first step, is to see if you beat the spell's TCN, which is Target Challenge Number. Every spell you cast has to beat this core number first. If none of your dice beat it, then the spell fizzles and not a success. The reason we have this mechanic is because unlike in most role-playing games, there are no prepared spell slots or spell points or limitations on how many spells you can cast per day. In GEAS, if you know a spell, you can cast it over and over and over and over again. The balancing mechanic is using this target challenge number, this TCN. At least one of your dice has to beat this in order to be a success. In this case, you're casting a Tier 1 spell, so you need to beat a 2. You obviously do that. It's very easy. Not only do you do that, you also have one additional dice that beat it, so that's considered an additional success. For damage spells, as it says right down here, you add 1 damage to your total damage. So as we talked about earlier, a Tier 1 spell has a base 2 damage, right? Since you got 1 additional success, that would instead be 3 damage if you were doing a damaging spell in this example. But you're not. For non-damaging spells, it's really kind of flexible on how you choose to do it. You have guidelines, but it's really left up to you as a GM in the table what sounds cool, what makes the most fun, and what makes the most sense within that spell. Since the Befuddle spell we talked about has a duration of 1 minute and you got 1 additional success, what you can do in this case is we'd bump that up to 2 minutes. It's twice as good as normal. So if the creature fails to defend against you, it would be befuddled for 2 minutes. So now what happens is all and any creatures in the target of your spell, since you know it went off, needs to try to resist it. You don't re-roll your dice again. You keep that. So for the player, it's pretty simple. You just roll your dice once and that's it. For the GM, if you're only using one target, I would suggest rolling the dice and see what happens. If you have multiple targets, which we'll explain in a little bit, I would suggest using a take half roll, and we'll get to that in just a minute. So the giant is potentially affected by your spell. So it needs to make an intellect check, and it rolls a d6 and gets a 4. You need to beat that 4. If it had more than one dice, you only ever look at the highest dice. When you're defending, like is explained in the melee video, you only look at the highest dice. In this case, you beat that 4, not once, but you also beat it by twice. You've already got your additional success, so you don't need to worry about that anymore. You know you've got 2 successes against it. So the giant is affected by the befuddle spell, and then on its next turn, it would suffer these penalties as explained here. So that's how a single target spell works. Now let's kind of back up a little bit and try the next example, which is a flame explosion spell. That's everybody's favorite spell. Fireball, blow it up, burn it. Everything dies in fire. In this case, the spell description says you cause a fire spirit to fill the area of effect within range with flame. Any creature within the area of effect must succeed on an agility ability check to avoid heat damage. If you have more than one success against the target, then that target takes an additional 1 point of burning damage at the start of their next turn unless extinguished. This is important because we talked about just a minute ago how you had more than one success against the giant befuddle, but it really doesn't matter as long as you got the one, that's what counts. Some spells will have a special power if you happen to get more than one success, and this is one of them. So remember that if you get more than one success against each target, that target will not only take the core damage, but will take an additional point of damage at the start of their next turn from burning. So that's the flame explosion power. So what we want to do with flame explosion is we're going to cast it as a tier 2. So it has a 3 base damage, and we want to do a 10-foot radius to be able to try to get as many options as we can. If you do cubes, the challenge with the cubes, you need to remember they need to be touching each other. You can't do one cube here, the one cube down over there, and then one cube over here. They all have to be at least touching the previous cube in order for it to work. You can't just spread them apart. So in this case, we want to get as many of these creatures as we can as a tier 2 spell, and a 10-foot radius is what we're going to do. So not only do we have this basic spell, 3 damage, we need to spend 5 vigor out of our figure pool to be able to cast this spell. At 10-foot radius, you're going to have to forgive my my hand drawing a little bit. But let's say that's going to be centered on a giant, so that's roughly that shape. Again, forgive the really rough drawing. You can get 3 of the creatures, but you won't be able to get that 4th idling in there. So now what we want to do is we know we're casting it as a tier 2 spell, so we need to beat a 4. The TCN then becomes a 4, not just a 2. So let's say we keep the same roll. You get the same roll, a 6 and a 5. Your SP does beat the 4, and you have an additional success that beats a 4. So your total damage for this spell is going to be 4 points. You have 3 base plus an additional success, so that's 4 points of damage. Now, each of these creatures in this pool needs to defend against that. What I would suggest as a GM is taking half. What taking half does is instead of sitting there and rolling tons of dice for the GM, each creature is going to just have a base number. Say the idlings may have a 3 and the giant might have a 5. So you need to beat that in order for them to be successful, in order for your spell to be successful against them, rather. It just keeps it simple, it makes things go away fast, and you as the GM aren't sitting there rolling tons of dice to figure out how it goes. And the take half value will be explained in the monster stack block, so no worries there. So what we'll do in this case, though, for purposes of this scenario, in this example, we are going to roll for each of these creatures. So the first thing that we do is the giant roll its defense. Let me get rid of that circle. And it gets an 8, defending against on its agility check to defend. The first idling rolls 2d6 and gets a 6 and a 2, and the second idling rolls 2d6 and gets a 3 and a 2. So this is where you start comparing different things. First is the easiest. Giant got an 8. You didn't beat that 8. So the giant manages to agilely duck out of the way and is not affected by the flame explosion spell. However, these might be. Let's look at this first idling here. Its highest die is a 6. Well, you tied it, right? So normally the ties go to the defender. But when you're casting a spell, let's go back to the actual description of that spell. It needs to make an agility ability check, right? So whenever you make an ability check, you have to beat the TCN, the difficulty challenge number. So in this case, as the spell's defined, it needs to beat your 6 in order to not be affected by it, because it's making the check to beat the number that you're setting. Your ASP roll is what's setting the TCN that all these creatures need to beat. And as we described in previously the dice pool video, you have to beat it. Meet does not beat. It met your 6, so it's still affected. It had to beat the 6. And in this case, 2d6, you could never beat a 6. So most likely what would happen as a GM is I would trade those 2d6 in for 1d8 and then roll again and see if I could beat the 6. But for this purpose, we're just explaining how the pools work. So in this example, this idling is affected. And this idling down here, its highest dice is a 3. Not only is it affected, but both of your dice affected it. And this is where we go back to the spell description. So that idling you have 2 successes to get that idling. So not only is it going to take damage, it's going to suffer 1 additional point of burn damage at the start of its turn. So the net result of all this is the giant avoids your spell. This idling is impacted by it, and it takes 4 damage, as we tallied early for the damage of the spell. And this idling down here is going to take 4 damage, and at the start of its next turn, it's going to take an additional point of damage, unless somehow it's extinguished or the fire is put out in the flame. So that's really a breakdown of how area of effect spells work versus single target spells work. I know it seems a little bit convoluted on here, but trust me, when you get into gameplay, it actually moves really, really fast. Like as explained in the previous videos, because it's using a dice pool system, you're not adding any modifiers to any of your dice rolls. You roll, compare the highest dice, and move on. There's no math involved in this. It's very quick, moves very fast, and it keeps players engaged, because then the next player gets to go, the next turn in the combat order gets to go, and you don't have people sitting there waiting, building dice towers for their turn. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it helped clarify things and make sense, and look forward to seeing you again on the next video. Thank you very much.